Imagining geographies. It is not given man to envisage reality. His is the greater gift to brood over chaos and shape it as he will. The age of discovery is known as much for feats of exploration as acts of discovery, stories of variously brave and foolhardy explorers pursuing grand ideas of irresistible geographies are legion. Many of these geographies and the expeditions in their pursuit continued as part of modern lore, treks through jungle and deserts or the mountains of the moon, voyages chasing ice through a northwest passage, the unending quest for Solomon's gold-rich mines. Their histories comprise true stories about imagined geographies, geographies constructed in rich detail in the mind's eye regardless of whether they do or do not have a real-world equivalent. The remarkable thing about the many imagined geographies of the early modern period is that these invented entities were conjured with such likeness to existing geographies and yet such promise of surpassing all that was had and known, that people were driven to commit their lives to their discovery, and the history of those willing to seek out the geographical entities they held true. Only a fraction went on to find a reality amenable to their preconceptions. Those few were rewarded with glory, vindication, and remembrance among the great explorers. For the greater number who failed in their quests for an imagined geography, there was only truth, though even that was infrequently appreciated. This book is about one such imagined geography, a place that existed in the minds of humans, both because and regardless of physical reality, the great southern continent. The name of Charles Sturt is little known outside the oldest continent, but, to an Australian, Sturt's exploits make him one of the great explorers like so many of his ilk. This is both because and in spite of his dogged pursuit of an imagined geography. In 1844 Sturt embarked on a quest of fancy and folly as spectacular in scope as it was cruel in its execution. 13 grueling months on foot, thousands of miles covered, and the Bayaliad on some of the least hospitable environs of the world in the search for a Mediterranean-style sea in the harsh Australian interior. So sure was Sturt that inevitable imminency must exist. He dragged a boat across countless miles of stones, sand, and desolation, his hopes and expectations always pushing ahead of the unpromising horizon. Suffice to say, Sturt did not launch his vessel, his disappointment couched in the sort of stoicism we have come to expect from the great explorers. Yet the fact of existence or non-existence in the history of pursuit is only ever half any story about the hunt for an imagined geography. Just as interesting and just as important is the fact that, before any audacious expeditions are embarked, people first figure upon the possibility of such geographies, and then, most stunningly of all, place their faith and trust in their actual existence. Even more extraordinary is that such belief rarely terminates at the intersection with reality. History shows that time and again faith trumps reality. Unambiguous evidence is gathered that disproves the ideas or arguments about a particular geography, yet people go on believing anyway. Believing in El Dorado, believing in an inland sea, believing in an eastern Eden. That is what makes these stories truly compelling. Not the apparent folly of heroic explorers dragging whaleboats through the arid outback, but the facility of imagination and belief that generate geographies so real and so essential they become more powerful than reality itself. The mythical southern continent has always loomed as one of the most intriguing and most significant imaginative geographies of the recent past. Anyone with a passing interest in early modern cartography will have seen it at the bottom of ornate Renaissance maps, enormous, elusive, and transfixing. Any continent's list of names and guises suggests a pedigree that spans multiple ages and empires. Antipodes, Magellanica, Beach, the Great Southland, Australia del Espiritu Santo, Gondoveland, Javelao Grande, Terra Australis, and the list goes on in its various iterations. The mythical southern continent has been the single most potent receptacle for European geographical expectation about the southern hemisphere, and one of the shaping forces of early modern history. It pushed men to the farthest reaches of the earth in search of fame, riches, kingdoms, souls, and ultimately truth, in the process revealing worlds hitherto unimagined. The question is why to apprehend what happened in the search for a southern continent is nigh meaningless without understanding why it should have been so, why these people sought this imagined geography, why they so long failed to see the realities they encountered, and why this mythic continent held the gaze of an era famed for breaking free the shackles of superstition. To understand all of this is not merely to compare the real with the imagined, or discovery with expectation, but to try to understand the society, the era, and the individual as perceivers and constructors of reality. This is the work of geosophy, the study of geographical knowledge from any or all points of view. The idea is to follow a narrative from the primary perspective of epistemology rather than ontology, that is, of people's idea of the earth rather than the strict realities of it. The value of such an undertaking is summarized by J. Rappert Watson. The geography of any place results from how we see it as much as from what may be seen there. Not all geography derives from the earth itself. Some of it springs from our idea of the earth as geography within the mind can at times be the effective geography to which man adjusts and thus be more important than the supposedly real geography of the earth. Man has the peculiar aptitude of being able to live by notions of reality which may be more real than the reality itself, as mental images should be of prime importance to the study of geography. Around the beginning of the 16th century, in the span of just a few decades, the Antipodes transitioned from a subject of occasional conjecture, as it had been throughout ancient and medieval times, to a geography proclaimed real. Powerful, influential people started believing not just that a southern continent might exist, but that a southern continent does exist. So the question is, what changed? A second issue relates to the inevitable results of belief in a geography that does not exist. People set out to discover it, only to find it is not there yet. From the 16th through 18th centuries, people kept on believing anyway, despite coasts of the southern continent being sailed through and disproved time and time again until the voyages of James Cook. There was no amount of violence that could be done to the imaginary southern continent sufficient to stop people believing. This book, then, is focused on addressing two elements of a single question. Why did people believe, and why did people continue believing in a great southern continent? These nuances of an adequate answer demand the remainder of this book's pages, but at the heart of it all is a simple proposition: people believe in the southern continent because they wanted it to be real. It was a geography worth believing in. People then continued to believe in the southern continent in the face of overwhelming proof of its non-existence, because authorities on the matter had always taught that it was real, and people still wanted it to be so. There is a danger that this concept, so simply stated, may appear facile in mundane states of mind, dispositions, tendencies, historical patterns. They can easily be described in a few words or a few sentences, and as a result seem obvious, devoid of any real insight. It is only once you see how those patterns or dispositions play out in terms of the elaborate web of things that people do and conspire to do that they start to mean something else. The concept might be a simple one, perhaps even making for a basic historical truism, that people, then as now, choose to believe in things that seem worth believing in, and they then work to make those things real. But it is a concept that takes on enormous meaning and significance when it is seen how this has shaped a history that begins in the 2nd century BC and ends in the furious 2 decades of voyaging that mark the 1760s and 70s. The focus of this book is the Western tradition during the early modern period, the period when the southern continent transitions from a conceptual entity engaging intellectual curiosity to an entity of indeterminate geography but cosmographic certitude. For it is the period in the history of the southern continent when the possible became the probable, and the probable became, for all intents and purposes, real. Introduction. What exists beyond? Truth isn't the reward of free spirits, the child of protracted solitude, not the privilege of those who have succeeded in liberating themselves. Truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. Michel Foucault called